He arrived before the sun did. Every single morning for 3 years, Robert Harlan pulled into the parking garage at 4:52 a.m., clocked in at the service entrance on the building's north side, and was already mopping the marble lobby by the time the sky outside started turning gray. He never complained. He never called in sick. He never asked for overtime. He was a janitor in a building that bore his last name, and for 3 years, not one person inside those glass walls knew it. This is the story of a man who chose invisibility over power, who gave up a corner office for a mop cart, and who watched quietly for 3 years until he knew exactly what he needed to know. Chicago in January is a specific kind of cold, the kind that gets into your coat before you've even stepped out of the car, the kind that makes the parking garage feel warm by comparison, the kind that after enough winters stops being something you fight and starts being something you just carry. Robert Harlan had carried it for 63 winters now. He was not a tall man, not broad-shouldered, not the kind of man who walked into a room and commanded attention. He had the build of someone who had worked with his hands his whole life, compact, efficient, nothing wasted. His hair had gone fully silver sometime in his early 50s and he'd stopped noticing. He wore it the same way he wore everything, without fuss. His uniform was standard issue. Gray pants, gray shirt, the building's facilities logo on the left breast pocket, steel-toed boots worn at the heel, a key ring on his belt with more keys than most people knew what to do with. He had a system. 4:52 a.m. clock in at the service entrance. 4:55 a.m. collect the cleaning cart from the supply closet on B2. 5:00 a.m. begin the lobby. The lobby was the most important part. It was what people walked into, what they saw first, what they used unconsciously to decide what kind of place this was. Robert understood that better than anyone. He'd mop the marble in long, even strokes, working from the far wall toward the main entrance, never crossing his own path. He'd polish the brass on the elevator doors until he could see his reflection in them, a little blurred, a little soft, the way reflections in brass always are. He'd restock the lobby reception desk with its small stack of business cards, straighten the chairs in the waiting area, wipe down the glass on the building directory. That directory, he'd stop in front of it every single morning. Harlan & Associates, floors 12 through 18, founding 1987, current CEO Diana Mercer. He'd look at it for exactly as long as it took to wipe the glass clean, then he'd move on. Let's talk about the building itself for a moment, because buildings like this don't just happen. The tower at 440 North Wacker Drive was 42 stories of glass and steel, built in 1985, commissioned by a man named Thomas Harlan, a self-made investor from the south side of Chicago who had spent 20 years learning money the hard way before he had any. Thomas Harlan was the son of a steelworker. He'd put himself through night school. He'd got his Series 7 license in 1971 and spent the next decade grinding in back offices of firms that didn't think men like him belonged in the room. By 1979, he had enough of his own clients to go independent. By 1982, he had enough capital to start a firm. By 1987, he had enough to build. He named the building after his family because that was the kind of man he was. Not the kind who named things after himself as a monument, the kind who named things after his family as a promise. This is what we built. This is what we protect. Thomas Harlan died in 2009 at 77 in the same South Side neighborhood where he'd grown up. He left the majority stake in the firm, 51%, to his only son. His son, Robert, was 48 years old at the time. He was also at the time sitting in a hospital room in Evanston holding his wife's hand. Her name was Catherine. They'd met in college, Northwestern, 1979. She was studying English literature. He was studying finance, half because his father wanted him to and half because numbers had always made sense to him in a way that most things didn't. They were married in 1983. 2 kids, a son Marcus born in 1986 and a daughter Ellie born in 1989. For 20 years, Robert was by all accounts a quietly excellent man, not flashy, not ambitious in the way that made other people uncomfortable. He worked at the firm, his father's firm, as a senior analyst, then a portfolio manager, then VP of institutional accounts. He was good at the job. He just wasn't particularly interested in running things. When his father died and left him majority control, Robert's first move was to empower the management team that was already there. He brought in a young, sharp, relentlessly capable woman named Diana Mercer, who'd been running a boutique fund in New York and was looking for something bigger. He gave her the CEO title and the authority to go with it, and he stepped back. That was 2010. By 2011, Catherine had been diagnosed, glioblastoma, grade IV. The kind of thing that doesn't negotiate. Robert spent the next 3 years doing what he'd always done, being present, being steady, being the person in the room who didn't fall apart. He handled her care with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. He drove her to every appointment. He researched every trial. He held her hand through every treatment that didn't work. She died in the spring of 2014. Marcus was 27, Ellie was 24. Robert was 53, and for the first time in his adult life, he didn't know what to do next. He had money. He had a majority stake in a firm managing $2 billion. He had a corner office he'd never really used, a building with his family name on it, and absolutely no idea how to fill the silence that Catherine had left behind. He did what a lot of men do when they don't know what to do. He disappeared into routine. He cooked. He walked. He drove Marcus and Ellie to dinner once a week and listened more than he talked. He read history mostly. Books about people who had built things and lost things and built again. And slowly, over the course of 2 or 3 years, a question started forming in the back of his mind. Not a loud question, not an urgent one, more like a low hum. Is the company still the company my father built? He got reports, of course, quarterly numbers, board minutes, Diana's strategic updates. By every metric, Harlan and Associates was doing well, better than well. But numbers don't tell you everything. Thomas Harlan had always said that. Numbers tell you what happened. They don't tell you why, and they don't tell you who. Robert wanted to know who. He wanted to know if the people inside that building, the people carrying his father's name on their business cards, were the kind of people his father would have been proud to work with. And he decided there was only one way to find out. He called the building's facilities manager in the fall of 2020. The manager's name was Gary Poulty, a broad, cheerful man in his late 50s who'd been with the building since 2003. Robert had met him exactly once at a facilities review meeting that Robert had attended in his capacity as building owner. Gary had no idea who he was talking to when the call came in. I'm looking for a custodial position, Robert said. Night shift, lobby and executive floors preferred. Gary told him they had an opening. One of the night crew had just retired. Any experience? Gary asked. Plenty, Robert said. He wasn't lying. His mother had cleaned office buildings for 11 years when he was a child. He'd gone with her on school holidays, pushing the cart, learning how to mop so you didn't leave streaks, how to empty a trash can without making noise, how to move through a space as though you were a part of it rather than an interruption. He showed up for the interview under his middle name. Robert Thomas Harlan became Thomas R. Harlan on the application. Nobody checked the building ownership records against a janitor application. Nobody would. He got the job. He started November 2nd, 2020. And for the next 3 years, he showed up before the sun did. Here is what you learn when you clean a building instead of running it. You learn who actually works late and who just leaves their lights on. You learn which managers treat the service staff like furniture and which ones say good morning and mean it. You learn where the tension is because tension leaves traces. Whispered arguments in conference rooms at 8 p.m. A stack of resume printouts left on a printer and retrieved too quickly. A department head who stops coming to the kitchen when another department head is there. You learn who is actually holding the culture together, and it is almost never who you think. Robert learned all of this. In the first month he catalogued quietly. The executive floor, floor 17, was where Diana and her senior leadership team worked. He cleaned it 3 nights a week. He watched. Diana Mercer was, he concluded by the end of month 2, a genuinely good executive, not perfect. She drove people hard, harder than some of them could sustain, and he'd watched the attrition in her lower-level analyst pool with a kind of sad recognition. She had a tendency to trust data over instinct in situations where instinct was the right call. And she had a blind spot for loyalty. She kept people close who had been with her a long time, even when those people had stopped growing. But she was honest. She was fair in ways that cost her something. He'd seen her overturn a bonus decision when she found out the original decision had been influenced by a manager's personal bias. He'd watched her on a night in March of his second year spend 45 minutes on the phone with a junior employee who was having a mental health crisis, patient present, not once looking at her watch. He'd also seen her cry once at her desk late on a Tuesday. He'd knocked before he came in to empty her trash the way he always did. She looked up, wiped her face quickly, said sorry, come in. He'd come in, emptied the trash, straightened the recycling bin. As he was leaving, she said, do you ever have days where you wonder if you're making the right calls? He paused. Every day, he said. Does it get easier? He thought about that for a moment. No, but you get better at living with it. She'd nodded slowly. He'd gone back to his cart. She hadn't looked at him when he left, but she remembered what he said. For 3 years, he mopped her floors. He watched her make hard calls and fair ones. He watched her lead a company of 400 people with more care than most people lead a department of 4. He watched his father's name on the building and asked himself every morning whether it still meant what his father had meant it to mean. And by the end of year 3, he had his answer. But before he could act on it, something happened. The firm's biggest client, a $400 million institutional account, announced it was leaving, and Diana Mercer was out of options. In part 2, the night Robert saved the company for $40, and the morning he decided to leave. There are nights that nobody talks about, nights where a company came within 2 hours of a catastrophe that would have made the front page of the business section, nights where the difference between disaster averted and everything gone was one person in the right place at the right time who didn't hesitate. Usually those people get a press release. Sometimes they get a plaque. Robert Harlan got $40, and he thanked Gary Poulty for it, put the check in his pocket, and went back to mopping. This is the story of that night, and what it meant, and what it cost. It was a Tuesday in April, year 2. The kind of night that starts with nothing happening. The overnight forecast was clear. The building was quiet by 7 p.m. later than usual because the quarter-end push had kept Diana's analytics team burning past 6. By 7:30, the executive floors were empty. By 8, most of the building was dark except for the server room on floor 14, and the cleaning staff moving floor by floor from the bottom up. Robert had worked his way to floor 11 by 9 p.m. There were 4 people on the overnight crew that night. Robert, a younger man named Deshawn who'd been on staff for 8 months, a woman named Patty who'd been there 14 years and knew the building better than anyone alive, and a contract worker covering for someone on medical leave whose name Robert had already forgot. The turnover in contract staff was high. Standard night, trash, vacuum, bathrooms, lobby glass. Robert had a rhythm. He never deviated from it unless something was wrong. At 9:17 p.m. something was wrong. He smelled it before he saw it. A faint, specific smell, not quite damp, not quite electric, but somewhere between the two. The smell of water where water isn't supposed to be. He stopped his cart at the hallway junction on floor 13 and stood still for a moment, orienting himself the way his mother had taught him to when something felt off in a building. Be quiet. Let the building tell you. The sound was almost nothing. A faint hiss, low frequency, coming from behind the east utility wall. He pressed his palm against the wall. It was warm. He found the service access panel 14 feet down the corridor, used one of the 37 keys on his belt ring to open it, and looked inside. The main supply pipe feeding the server room's cooling system had developed a hairline fracture, probably stress-related, probably had been developing for weeks, maybe months. The fracture had finally given enough to weep. Not a burst, not yet, but the water was sheeting down the inside of the wall cavity and pooling in the subfloor space beneath the server room. 2 hours, maybe 3, before it reached the raised floor system under the servers. If it reached the servers, the damage would be, Robert calculated this in roughly 4 seconds, because he had spent 20 years in finance and understood asset value, catastrophic. Floor 14 housed the primary servers for the firm's trading systems, client data, and compliance records. The backup systems were off-site, but the last backup had run at 6 p.m., 3 hours of trading activity unsaved, client data potentially corrupted, regulatory exposure. He did not think about any of this consciously. He moved. Robert called Gary Pulte from the utility corridor. Gary answered on the third ring, groggy. It was 9:22 p.m. There's a cooling pipe fracture on 13 east wall feeding the server room above. You need to call the emergency plumber and the facilities engineer right now. Gary was awake fast. How bad? Bad enough. Make the calls. I'm going to start redirecting the water. With what? You've got a cleaning cart. That's enough. He used everything on his cart, the mop bucket, the secondary collection buckets, the cleanup bags, the extra mop heads he hadn't needed yet that night. He opened the service panel wide and rigged a series of diversions that a plumber would have laughed at, and that worked anyway. Nothing elegant, just effective. He redirected the sheet water from the subfloor path toward the utility channel on the building's east drainage route, buying time. Deshawn found him at 9:45, heard the situation, and without being asked went and got every additional bucket, every absorbent mat, every piece of water diversion equipment in the supply closet. He didn't ask questions, he just worked. Paddy arrived with the emergency wet vac from the B2 storage room at 10:02. The plumber showed up at 10:48 and fixed the fracture in 40 minutes. The facilities engineer arrived at 11:30, assessed the subfloor, confirmed no water had reached the raised flooring under the servers. The servers were fine. The data was fine. The firm's trading systems came online the next morning at 6 a.m. with no incidents. Robert clocked out at 1:17 a.m., 4 hours and 45 minutes past his scheduled end time. He didn't file for overtime. He'd forgotten, and by the time he remembered, it seemed like a lot of paperwork for something he'd have done anyway. The facility's incident report landed on Diana Mercer's desk at 8:43 the next morning, flagged as Level 2, significant risk event successfully mitigated. She read it twice. The report was dry, as incident reports are. Cooling system pipe failure, east wall, floor 13. Potential catastrophic data loss averted by prompt response of overnight custodial staff. There was a list of actions taken, a timeline, a repair assessment, and a footnote about the response team. Primary response, T. Harlan, overnight custodial, and D. Williams, overnight custodial. Secondary response, P. Vasquez, overnight custodial. Emergency contractor support, Allied Plumbing. Diana sat with that for a moment. She'd been in this building for 13 years. She had a risk management team, a facilities management team, an IT infrastructure team, and an emergency response protocol that covered 37 different scenarios. Her servers had nearly drowned, and the person who stopped it was a man with a mop bucket she called Gary. The custodial staff who responded last night, I want them recognized. Of course, Gary said, I'll put in for a discretionary bonus. What's the standard amount? A pause. For custodial staff, the discretionary incident bonus is usually $50 to $100 for the primary responder, $25 for secondary. Diana was quiet for a moment. She thought about the report, about the timeline, about a man who had smelled water in the wrong place, identified a fracture, improvised a diversion system, and called it in all before the plumber arrived. She thought about the cost of losing those servers. The regulatory exposure alone would have been in the 7 figures. She thought about what she wanted to say and what was actually within her authority under the facility's staff compensation structure, and the answer was not what she wished it was. Do the standard amounts, she said finally, and add a note of recognition to their files. Make sure Gary delivers it personally. She hung up and went back to her calendar. Robert Harlan received his check 2 weeks later with the rest of his pay cycle. His share, $40. He looked at it for a moment. Then he folded it in half and put it in his wallet. Let's be honest about what $40 is. It is not a small amount to everyone. There are people in this world for whom $40 is a week of groceries, a tank of gas, a month of a child's medication. It is not nothing. But Robert Harlan was worth, conservatively, north of $60 million. The $40 check did not impact his finances. What it impacted was his understanding. He had already, in 2 years of mopping floors, developed a clear-eyed picture of what it felt like to be invisible in a place that was, on paper, partly his. He'd felt the specific neutrality of being looked through rather than looked at. The way that a uniform flattens a person turns them from a specific human being with a specific history into a function. The cleaning person, the guy with the cart, he hadn't minded, he'd expected it. He'd come to watch, not to be seen, but the $40 crystallized something, not anger. He wasn't angry at Diana, she'd done what the system allowed her to do. She'd done it with more grace than many would have. What it crystallized was a question he'd been asking for 2 years in a vague, background way. What does this company think people are worth? He'd seen good things. He'd seen Diana fight for a junior employee's salary correction when she found out the number was below market. He'd seen the firm's DEI commitments not just on paper, but in the actual composition of the senior team, earned, not performative. He'd watched the firm's pro bono advisory program, which gave free financial planning to nonprofits, quietly grow under Diana's stewardship. He'd also seen the ceiling. The way the custodial staff, the building maintenance crew, the cafeteria workers on floors 6 and 7, the people who made the building function were present everywhere and considered no. It wasn't cruelty, it was the ordinary structural kind of blindness that every organization has in some form if nobody at the top is paying attention. And Diana, for all her genuine goodness, was not paying attention to this. The $40 told him that. He sat with it for a while. By the end of year 3, Robert had made his assessment. The firm was fundamentally sound. The culture, complicated like all cultures, not perfect but alive, was worth protecting. Diana Mercer was worth trusting. But the firm was also at a crisis point that Diana didn't fully understand yet. The $400 million client, a pension fund called Great Lakes Institutional, had been growing restless for 8 months. Robert knew this not from reports but from fragments. An overheard conversation between Diana and her CFO in the elevator one Thursday morning, a late-night call he'd caught the end of when he came in to empty Diana's trash at 10 p.m., the way the financial projections on the whiteboard in conference room 17B had stopped being updated after the third quarter. He also knew something Diana didn't. The head of Great Lakes Institutional was a man named Walter Forsythe. 71 years old, son of a steelworker from Gary, Indiana, he had been for 40 years one of Thomas Harlan's closest friends. Walter Forsythe had invested with Harlan & Associates in 1991 when the fund was a fraction of its current size because Thomas Harlan had personally called him and said, "Walter, I'm building something, not just a fund, something my kids can be proud of. I want you to be part of it." Walter had never forgotten that call. He had stayed with the firm for 30 years because of what Thomas had built. But Thomas was gone, and over the past 3 years the thing Walter had been watching for, the thing Thomas had always talked about, the soul of the place, he wasn't sure he saw it anymore. He wasn't wrong to look, but he was looking in the wrong places. Robert put in his notice on a Thursday morning. 2 weeks, no drama. Gary was surprised. "You sure? You've got perfect attendance. You're one of the best we have." "Thank you, Gary," Robert said. "I'm sure." He had one thing left to do, and he needed to do it as Robert Harlan, not as the man with the mop. His second to last day, he arrived at his usual time, 4:52 a.m., service entrance, key card. He mopped the lobby one more time, the long, even strokes. The brass elevator doors, until his reflection looked back at him, a little blurred, a little soft. He stopped in front of the building directory. Harlan & Associates, floors 12 through 18. He pressed his palm flat against the glass, stood there for a moment. Then he finished his shift, clocked out, changed, and took the elevator to the 17th floor. In his regular clothes, dark slacks, a gray shirt, the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything, he knocked on the frame of Diana Mercer's office door. She looked up. She did not recognize him for a full 3 seconds, then something shifted in her face. The slight disorientation of seeing someone in the wrong context. The janitor, except without the uniform, he didn't look like the janitor anymore. He didn't look like anyone she'd ever seen before. He looked, standing in the doorway of the office in his father's building, exactly like what he was. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "my name is Robert Harlan. I think it's time we talked." She'd been the CEO for 13 years. She'd made thousands of decisions in that time, hired and fired. Restructured and rebuilt, fought for the firm's survival through 2 recessions and a pandemic. She had walked through the lobby of that building 10,000 times. She had never once read the name on the building directory. Not really. Not the way you read something when it matters. The day she found Robert Harlan's name on the building, she was 44 years old at the height of her career and sitting in the office that used to belong to the man who built the place. She sat very still. And she thought, how long has he known that I didn't know? 3 days before Robert knocked on Diana's door, she'd already started pulling the thread. It had started as so many things do, with a small thing, an anomaly. She'd been reviewing the monthly facilities report, something she did quickly because facilities reports are not glamorous reading. But she'd noticed something in the night crew attendance record. A single entry, T. Harlan, 38 months consecutive, 0 absences, 0 incidents. She'd circled it without quite knowing why. 38 months, just over 3 years, that was unusual. In a facilities staff that turned over at roughly 40% annually, 38 months of perfect attendance was essentially unheard of. She'd mentioned it to Gary in their bi-weekly check-in. "Who's T. Harlan?" she asked. "Night custodial," Gary said. "Thomas Harlan, good worker, best I've got, honestly. He's actually just put in his notice, leaving in 2 weeks. Real shame." Diana had looked at the name again. Thomas Harlan. She didn't say anything, but she'd felt something, a small, quiet wrongness, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind you get when a pattern doesn't quite line up. After the meeting, she pulled up the building's corporate registration from the property management files. Harlan and Associates, original founder, Thomas E. Harlan, 1987. Majority ownership 51%, transferred upon death of T. E. Harlan 2009 to R.T. Harlan's son, R.T. Harlan, Robert Thomas Harlan. She had sat very still with that for a long time. She ran the name, not a full background check. She wasn't going to do that to a member of her custodial staff, not without more certainty. But she pulled what was publicly available, board records, the original ownership transfer documentation. A profile from a 2008 finance industry magazine, before his father died, before everything changed, where a younger Robert Harlan had been quoted in a piece about multi-generational investment families. The photograph was 20 years old. He was younger in it. His hair was dark, but the build was right, the quiet efficiency in the posture. She went back through 3 years of facilities reports. The server room incident was in there. T. Harlan, primary responder. He'd read it at the time and moved on. She read it again now, and the thing she'd pushed past the first time, the knowledge, the precision, the improvised response system that a professional plumber had said in his follow-up notes showed exceptional understanding of building infrastructure, landed differently. She thought about the night she'd been crying at her desk, the man who'd come in to empty her trash, the exchange she hadn't quite forgot. Do you ever have days where you wonder if you're making the right calls? Every day, does it get easier? No, but you get better at living with it. She'd thought about that off and on for 2 years. She thought it was the wisdom of an older man who lived a hard life. She hadn't been wrong. She'd just been wrong about what hard life he'd lived. She took the elevator down to the lobby at 6:30 a.m. before most of the staff arrived. She stood in front of the building directory. She'd walked past this thing 10,000 times. She'd looked at it the way you look at furniture, present, functional, not worth reading. She read it now. Harlan and Associates, floors 12 through 18, founding 1987. She looked at the building name above the entrance, the one etched in the stone lintel above the front doors, the one she'd walked under every day for 13 years. Harlan. She stood there until the lobby started filling up with morning arrivals. Then she went back upstairs. She was at her desk at 9:15 when he knocked. She recognized him immediately, not in the full sense, not the moment she looked up. There was the disorientation of context. You see a person in a uniform long enough and the uniform becomes part of how you see them. Strip the uniform away and you see someone different, even if the face is the same. But the stillness was the same, the economy of movement, the way he stood in the doorway without filling it with nervous energy. The way he waited for her to register him without any of the social static most people fill silence with. She'd been waiting for this, she realized. Not consciously, not precisely, but in some part of her she'd known since she pulled that corporate file that this conversation was coming. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "my name is Robert Harlan. I think it's time we talked." She had prepared 3 or 4 things to say. None of them came. What she said was, "I know," a pause. "I know," she said again. "I figured it out about 6 months ago." He came in and sat down across from her desk. She noticed that he sat the same way he stood, without waste, without performance, back straight, hands in his lap. He didn't fidget. He didn't look around the office with the curiosity of someone entering a space for the first time. He'd cleaned this office 3 nights a week for 3 years. He knew where everything was. 6 months, he said. The facilities report, the attendance record. She paused. The name. He nodded slowly. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking. "Because if I had," he said, "the rest of the time would have been different. You'd have been aware of me. I wouldn't have been seeing the real thing. And instead, I saw the real thing." She looked at him. "What did you see?" He took a breath, slow and even. "I saw a company that still deserves my father's name on it," he said, "not because it's perfect, but because the person running it is trying to do it right. That's rare." Diana was quiet for a long moment. In 13 years of running this firm, she had received a lot of feedback from boards, from clients, from consultants, from performance reviews. She'd been called decisive and demanding and occasionally impossible. Nobody had ever said this to her. Nobody had ever watched to see if she was worth the trust and then told her she was. She found that she had to be careful with what her face was doing. "There's a problem," she said finally. "The Great Lakes account," he said. "You know about that." "I know about Walter Forsythe," he said. "I know what he's looking for, and I know you can't give it to him because you don't have it to give." "What do you think he's looking for?" Robert looked at her steadily. "His friend," he said. "He's looking for my father." Diana had met Walter Forsythe 4 times over 13 years. He was a formal man, courteous, precise. He asked good questions in board presentations and gave nothing away in his face. She'd always respected him without quite being able to read him. She'd been managing the Great Lakes relationship as a financial relationship. Performance numbers, fee structures, risk parameters. She had not even known to ask that the relationship had started as a personal one. A phone call between 2 men from the South Side who had both bet everything on something they believed in. "He's been with the firm for 30 years, Robert said, "because my father asked him to be, not because of returns. My father called him personally, said he was building something his kids could be proud of. Walter believed him." Diana absorbed this, "and now he doesn't believe it anymore." "He doesn't know if he believes it. There's a difference." Robert paused. "He's looking for evidence that what my father built still matters to someone who matters. And you're that someone. I'm one of them." His eyes were steady. "So are you if you let yourself be." They talked for 1 hour and 40 minutes, not about the firm's financials, not about the board, not about Walter Forsythe or the $400 million account. They talked about Thomas Harlan, about what he'd built and why, about the specific philosophy, numbers tell you what happened, not who, that had shaped how he ran the firm. About the people Thomas had mentored, some of whom were still in the building, some of whom had moved on and built their own things. Diana found herself asking questions she hadn't known she had, questions about the origins of decisions she'd inherited and always taken as given. Questions about why certain practices at the firm, the pro bono advisory program, the internal mentorship structure, the unwritten rule that no client was turned away from a basic planning consultation without at least one conversation existed. What they meant, Robert answered all of them. At some point during the conversation, she realized that she had been running this firm as though it were her firm, which in the operational sense it was, but there was a deeper sense in which it was something else. Something older, something that had been handed to her in trust. She wasn't sure until that moment that she had fully understood the trust part. By the end of the conversation she did. As Robert stood to leave, he paused. "There's one more thing," he said. "The custodial staff, the overnight crew, I want you to know who they are, not as a category, as people." She looked at him. "Gary can make the introductions," Robert said, "but it should come from you. Walk the building at night sometime, meet them. Know their names." It wasn't a demand, it wasn't a condition. It was a request from someone who had watched for 3 years and knew exactly where the gap was. "I'll do that," she said. He nodded once, reached out his hand. She shook it. "Thank you," she said, "for watching." He almost smiled. "Thank your father's building," he said. "It takes care of itself." And he walked to the elevator, pressed the button and left. In part 4, the full story of who Robert really was. The wife he lost, the company he left, and why a man worth $60 million picked up a mop. People hear a story like this and they immediately want to understand the decision. Why would a man worth $60 million take a minimum wage job mopping floors? Why would someone with a majority stake in a $2 billion firm, a firm with his name on the building, spend 3 years emptying trash cans and scrubbing bathroom tiles? Was it guilt? Was it grief? Was it some kind of test? The answer is all of those things and also none of them, because the truth about why people make the choices they make is almost never as clean as the question. Here is the full story of Robert Harlan, not just what he did, who he was, and what he lost. To understand Robert, you have to start with Thomas. Thomas Eugene Harlan was born in 1932 in the Inglewood neighborhood of Chicago's South Side. His father worked the steel mills in South Chicago. His mother cleaned office buildings downtown 3 nights a week. They were not poor in the way that breaks people. They were working people, resourceful, church-going, proud of what they had and practical about what they didn't. Thomas grew up with a clear and early understanding that money was not a given. It was something you built carefully over time and then maintained with equal care. He was good at school. Better than good, he was the kind of student that teachers remember. Sharp, disciplined, curious. He won a scholarship to the University of Illinois in 1950 and studied economics because his high school math teacher, a man named Mr. Gerald, had told him that economics was the closest thing the academic world had to understanding how people actually made decisions. Thomas had never forgotten that. He spent his 20s in the back offices of other people's firms, learning everything he could about how money moved. He got his licenses. He built a client list slowly: families, small business owners, retirees who didn't have enough money for the big firms to care about but who deserved the same quality of advice. By 1979, he was independent. By 1982, he had a firm. By 1987, he had a building, and throughout all of it, through every year of the climb, he had brought his son to work with him, not in the formal sense. Robert wasn't shadowing his father in board meetings at age 10. He was just present, sitting in the office after school while his father worked, listening, asking questions that Thomas always answered as honestly as he could, even when the honest answer was complicated. "Dad, why does that client trust you more than the big banks?" Thomas had looked at his son across the desk. "Because I called him by his first name before I asked him for his money," he said. "Most people in this business have that order backwards." Robert had written that down in the small notebook he carried everywhere. He was 12 years old. Robert was not his father. He was like his father in the ways that mattered: the ethics, the patience, the instinct for people. But Thomas had a quality that Robert had always observed without quite being able to replicate. Thomas was energized by the work of building, by the competition, the growth, the visible progress of something expanding. Robert was not wired for expansion. He was wired for understanding. He'd gone to Northwestern Finance as his father wanted, with a minor in history because he couldn't help himself. He'd graduated in 1983, gone to work at a small analytics firm for 2 years, then come to his father's company in 1985 as a junior analyst. And he'd found in the firm a home that fit him exactly, not because of the status or the money, because of the puzzle. Every portfolio was a story, a family's choices and fears and hopes expressed in numbers. Every market cycle was a lesson in human psychology written in prices. He could spend 8 hours pulling apart a client's risk exposure and feel, at the end of it, the same satisfaction other men got from finishing a novel. He was not suited to be CEO. He knew this about himself. He had no talent for the performative parts of leadership, the presentations, the press, the room reading that great executives do naturally. He was better as the person behind the great executive, the one who made sure the numbers were right, the analysis was honest, the advice was grounded. When his father died in 2009 and left him majority control, the first thing Robert had done was call Diana Mercer. "I've been watching your fund's numbers for 2 years, he told her. "I want to talk to you about the company my father built." Diana had flown to Chicago from New York. They'd had a 4-hour conversation in a conference room on floor 17. Robert had given her the CEO job with a single condition: run it like it matters to you, not like a vehicle, like it matters. She'd looked at him for a long moment. It will, she said. He'd believed her. He still believed her. He met Catherine Walsh at a Northwestern faculty mixer in the fall of 1979. She was there because one of her English professors had insisted she come. She was 21, in the middle of her senior year, planning to move to New York after graduation to try to get a job at a publishing house. She was funny in a dry, observational way that came out sideways rather than front on. She had a habit of tilting her head when she was thinking, as though looking at an idea from a different angle. Robert had noticed her from across the room and spent 45 minutes constructing a reason to talk to her that didn't sound constructed. He'd finally walked over and said, "You look like someone who doesn't want to be here either." She'd looked at him. "I was told there would be food," she said. "There is food. I mean real food." They'd left the mixer and gone to a diner 3 blocks away and talked until 2 a.m. He proposed in 1982. They were married in a small ceremony in June of 1983, with Thomas Harlan in the front row crying without any attempt to hide it. Catherine never went to New York. She got a job at a Chicago publishing house instead and built a career editing literary fiction for 30 years. She was good at it, patient, exacting, possessing an ability to see what a writer was trying to do and help them do it more fully than they could alone. She and Robert had a marriage that their children would describe in later years, not as perfect but as present. They argued as real couples do. About money, about time, about the 1,000 ordinary frictions of building a life. But they argued the way people argue when they're committed to the resolution not to win but to understand. Robert would say in the years after she was gone that the most important thing Catherine had given him was the habit of paying attention. She was the most attentive person he had ever known. She remembered everything not to use it, but because other people's details seemed genuinely important to her. He'd learned to do it from watching her. In January of 2011, Catherine told Robert she'd been having headaches. Not bad headaches, she said, just persistent, in the same place. Behind her left eye mostly. She'd been putting off seeing a doctor because she had a manuscript deadline and also because she was the kind of person who put off seeing doctors. Robert drove her to the appointment. The headaches were a tumor. He remembered the doctor saying the words and the specific quality of the silence that followed them. Not stunned silence, he'd heard the words clearly. It was more like the silence of a room after something has been broken, present and total and impossible to unfill. Catherine had asked 2 questions: what are the treatment options and how long do we have? The doctor had answered both carefully and honestly. The treatment options were aggressive. The timeline, even with treatment, was not good. Glioblastoma grade IV moves on its own schedule, and it is not a schedule that accommodates plans. Robert had driven home. He'd sat in the parking garage for 11 minutes before going inside, then he'd gone inside and made dinner. That was the arrangement they came to, not in words but in action. They would be honest about what was happening, and they would also, as much as possible, keep living. Keep cooking dinner, keep going to Marcus's law school graduation, keep having Catherine's book club over on the 3rd Thursday of the month, keep being present for the ordinary things because the ordinary things were what a life was made of. It took 3 years. It was terrible, and also in the way that impossible things sometimes are, full of grace. She died in April of 2014 in the bedroom of their house in Evanston with Robert and Marcus and Ellie beside her. The window was open. The trees outside had just started coming back. The weeks after Catherine's death were functional. There was a service to plan. She'd wanted a small one, just family and close friends. There were legal matters. There was the logistics of dismantling a shared life, which is more logistically complex than people who haven't done it understand. Robert managed all of it the way he managed everything, methodically, without visible distress. He went back to work, not the firm's office, but his own home office, reviewing reports and board materials. Diana managed the day-to-day. He was available when she needed him. He attended the major board meetings by phone. He functioned, but functioning and living are not the same thing. The children worried. Marcus called every Sunday. Ellie came to Chicago every other month. They were careful with him in a way that he found both touching and slightly impossible to receive, too gentle, as though he might break, when what he actually needed was the ordinary friction of being treated normally. He started walking. Long walks, early mornings, around Evanston, through the neighborhoods he and Catherine had moved through for 30 years, past the houses of people they knew and people they'd lost track of, past the school where Ellie had learned to ride a bike, past the diner where they'd had their second date, the same diner they'd gone to on their 30th anniversary for the symmetry of it. He read, he cooked, he gave money to causes Catherine had cared about, and slowly in the background the question grew louder. Is the company still the company my father built? He'd always trusted Diana. He still trusted Diana, but trust and certainty are different instruments. Trust is a feeling, certainty is something you verify. He wanted to verify it. Not from a distance, not through reports, up close. It came to him on a walk in the fall of 2020. He'd been thinking about his mother, about those school holiday mornings in the downtown office buildings, pushing the cart, learning to be invisible. How well she'd known those buildings. How completely she'd understood the people in them, not from conversations, but from observation. From being present in a way that the people she was observing never thought to account for. You learn more from the bottom of a place than the top, she'd said once. The bottom is where things actually happen. He'd thought about that all the way home. He'd made the call to Gary Pulte that afternoon. What followed he knew would either confirm what he hoped was true or tell him something he needed to know and hadn't wanted to face. He was prepared for either answer. That was perhaps the most important thing Catherine had taught him. You have to be willing to see what's actually there. He had picked up the mop, and he had looked. The full confrontation, every word of the conversation that changed the company, and the thing Diana said that Robert didn't expect. If you'd told Diana Mercer at any point in her 13-year tenure as CEO that the most important conversation of her career would take place outside the executive bathroom on floor 17 of her own building, she'd have assumed you were making a metaphor. She wasn't. It started with a knock. It lasted 11 minutes, and it said more in those 11 minutes than 37 board meetings had managed to say in 13 years. This is the full conversation, every word of it. Let us go back 2 days before the office meeting that part 3 covered, to a moment Diana had not mentioned to Robert and that Robert had not known about. Tuesday evening, 8:42 p.m. The executive floor was mostly empty. Diana was still at her desk, she usually was at this hour, when the quieter parts of her brain could do the work that the crowded daytime hours didn't allow. She had a habit, in these late evenings, of moving between her desk and the small seating area near the window, depending on whether she was working or thinking. She was thinking. On the coffee table in front of the seating area she'd laid out 3 things: a copy of the Great Lakes Institutional letter stating their intention to move their assets at the end of Q4, the facility's incident report from the server room near Miss with T. Harlan's name highlighted, a printed photograph from the 2008 Finance Industry magazine profile, Robert Harlan, mid-40s, dark-haired, standing in front of this building. She'd been sitting with these 3 documents for 40 minutes when she heard the knock at the service door, the knock that had preceded every trash pickup for the past 3 years. She looked at the door. "Come in," she said. The door opened. He came in with his cart the way he always did. He moved to her trash can, which was beside her desk, which meant he had to pass the coffee table. He glanced at it. He didn't slow down. He didn't react. But she was watching his face, and she saw it, the micro-recognition. The slight stilling of the eyes, the fraction of a second where everything in him went completely quiet. He emptied the trash. He moved to the recycling. She waited. He was at the door, cart in hand, when she said, "I found your photograph." He stopped. Long pause. "I know," he said. "How long have you known that I knew?" "Since you pulled the corporate file 6 months ago," he said. "Gary mentioned you'd asked about my attendance record." She absorbed this. "And you didn't say anything?" "You didn't say anything," he replied. "I assumed you had a reason." She'd been deciding what to do with the information, whether it changed anything, whether to call him in, whether to call her board chair. She decided to wait, to watch. The same instinct he'd followed for 3 years, she'd used for 6 months. "I'm going to come to your floor tomorrow," he said. "In the morning, as myself." "All right," she said. "I know about Walter Forsythe," he added. "I can help if you let me." She nodded slowly. He pushed his cart to the next room. She sat with the 3 documents for another hour before she went home. The morning he came to her floor, Diana arrived earlier than usual. She was at her desk by 6:15. She'd told her assistant to hold her calendar until 10. She'd made her own coffee, something she did only when she needed her hands occupied while she thought. She'd been thinking about Thomas Harlan. She'd never met Thomas Harlan. He'd died in 2009, the year she was hired, before she'd ever set foot in this building. Everything she knew about him, she knew from documents and from the institutional memory of people who'd worked with him. She'd always thought of him as historical. The founder, the origin story. She had not, until now, thought about what it might mean to be his son, to carry that. The weight of having inherited not just assets and equity, but something harder to quantify, a man's legacy, his idea of what a company was supposed to be. The weight of watching that inheritance from a distance through reports and numbers and not quite knowing if it was being honored or just maintained. The weight of deciding you needed to check, not by calling a meeting, by picking up a mop. She thought about that. She thought about what kind of person does that, rather than simply exercising their majority ownership to demand access. What kind of restraint, what kind of trust? He could have called her to a meeting on day 1 and demanded a full cultural audit. He could have brought in consultants. He could have done a dozen things that would have been completely within his rights. Instead, he'd gotten a service entrance key card and showed up at 4:52 a.m. because he wanted to see the real thing. Because he trusted the real thing more than any audit. She found that she had a great deal of respect for a person like that. More possibly than she'd had for anyone who'd walked into her office in 13 years. The conversation in her office, as Part 3 described, covered Walter Forsythe, Thomas Harlan's philosophy, and the question of whether the firm still deserved its name. But there was a part of the conversation that Parts 3 glossed over. The part where Diana asked him a question he didn't expect. About halfway through, after he'd talked about what he'd seen, after she'd acknowledged the gap in how the firm treated its support staff, she leaned back in her chair and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What if I'd failed? What if you'd come in 3 years ago and found out the culture was rotten, the people were cynical, the ethics were performative, the firm was coasting on your father's name without honoring it?" He looked at her steadily. "Then I'd have come back," he said, "as yourself, as myself, and done whatever needed doing," he said, "restructured, replaced, rebuilt if necessary." "That's a significant thing to hold over someone for 3 years without telling them," she said. "It wasn't an accusation, it was an observation." He considered it. "Yes," he said, "it is." "Did you think about the fairness of that, watching someone without their knowledge, judging them by a standard they didn't know they were being held to?" This was, Robert recognized, a genuinely good question. He had in fact thought about it. He'd thought about it in year one when he'd first started to form opinions about Diana. He'd questioned whether it was right to evaluate someone against a rubric they didn't know existed. I thought about it, he said. I decided that the absence of the standard was itself the evaluation. Any good leader should behave the same whether or not they know they're being watched. And if most people don't, then most people don't deserve the trust. She was quiet. Do you think I would have behaved differently if I'd known? She asked. No, he said. That's why I'm here. She looked at him for a long moment. Your father, she said. Did he do this? Watch people constantly, Robert said. Not covertly, just attentively. He paid attention in a way most people don't. He said the most important skill in business wasn't analysis. It was noticing. Noticing what? What people were like when they thought nobody important was watching. Diana was quiet again. The custodial staff, she said. Yes, he would have noticed that. He did notice that, Robert said. He noticed it in his own firm in the 90s. He spent 2 years redesigning the support staff compensation and recognition structure. It was one of the things he was most proud of. I didn't know that. It's in the archived board minutes from 1997, Robert said. Volume 12, I think. My mother helped him draft the proposal. Diana blinked. Your mother? She cleaned office buildings for 11 years, Robert said. She knew what the work was worth. He listened to her. The conversation was winding down when Robert's phone buzzed. He looked at it briefly. A message from Marcus, his son, checking in as he did every Thursday morning. He put the phone back in his pocket and stood. Diana walked him to the door. They were in the hallway, the executive corridor, floor 17, when they passed the door to the executive bathroom. The door Robert had cleaned 3 nights a week for 3 years. He paused. She paused beside him. They both looked at it for a moment, and then quietly he said something she hadn't expected. My mother cleaned the executive bathrooms in a building on La Salle Street for 4 years in the late 60s, he said. Same job, same hours, different building. He looked at the door. She used to say that the bathrooms told you more about a company's culture than the mission statement did. How so? If the people on the top floor treat the bathroom the same way they'd treat it if someone was watching, he said. They're the right people. Diana thought about that. And ours, he almost smiled. Yours are fine, he said. He pressed the elevator button. She stood beside him in the corridor, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The building hummed around them, the quiet morning startup sounds of a company coming to life, the distant murmur of someone in a glass-walled office on a call, the soft percussion of the coffee machine running in the kitchen down the hall. One more thing, he said. The custodial staff. Deshaun Williams, he said. He's been on staff for 3.5 years. He has a degree in civil engineering from DePaul. He's been trying to get an interview with the facilities management team for 8 months. Nobody's called him back. Diana looked at him. Patty Vasquez, 14 years. She knows more about the mechanical systems in this building than any of your licensed engineers. She's been passed over for the facilities lead position 3 times because she doesn't have a formal certification. He paused. And there's a man on the morning crew, Elias Reyes, who has been helping your junior analysts find parking space workarounds in the garage for 2 years. He's the one who explained the fee structure to new hires personally because nobody in HR bothered. He's been late 3 times in 4 years, all of them because the blue line had service delays. The elevator arrived. He stepped in. They're good people, he said. They've been invisible. They deserve to be seen. The doors closed. Diana stood in the corridor for a long moment. Then she walked back to her office, sat down at her desk, and opened a new email to Gary Polte. Subject, can you come to my office today? I'd like to talk about the support staff. One day before all of this, his last official shift, Robert had done what he always did. 4:52 a.m., service entrance, key card. He collected his card. He mopped the lobby. He polished the elevator doors. He stopped in front of the building directory, Harlan and Associates. He stood there longer than usual, not dramatically, just present with it, the way you are with things you're leaving. He thought about his father, about the call Thomas had made to Walter Forsythe in 1991. I'm building something, not just a fund, something my kids can be proud of. His father hadn't said my company, he'd said my kids. It had always been about something larger than the business. Robert had understood this abstractly for 40 years. Standing in the lobby at 5:15 a.m. with a mop, he understood it in his body. He finished his shift. He clocked out. He left his uniform folded neatly on the supply room shelf with a small note for Gary. It's been a privilege. Take care of the building. He changed in his car in the parking garage, drove home to Evanston, made breakfast. His daughter called at 8 a.m. How are you, Dad? Good, he said, and he meant it more fully than he had in a while. What did you do this morning? He looked out the kitchen window at the November sky. I finished something, he said, and I think I started something else. On a Thursday morning in November, a 71-year-old man in a house in Lake Forest, Illinois, got a phone call. He almost didn't answer it. He didn't recognize the number. He'd been getting more calls from numbers he didn't recognize lately. The world had gotten noisier in that particular way, and his policy, developed sometime in his late 60s, was to let the unknown ones go to voicemail. But something made him pick up. Maybe the area code, maybe the time of day. Maybe some older instinct that he'd learned long ago to trust. He answered. Walter, the voice said. It's Robert Harlan, Thomas's son. Walter Forsythe had not heard that voice in 15 years. He sat down. Let us tell you about Walter. Born 1955, Gary, Indiana, son of James Forsythe, who worked the steel mills for 31 years and retired with a bad back, a pension that was smaller than it should have been, and an absolute conviction that his children were going to college. Walter had Northwestern University, class of 1977, Finance, like Robert, the same program 3 years earlier. They'd overlapped by a single semester, known each other slightly not well. What had brought them together wasn't school, it was Thomas. Thomas Harlan had met Walter at a finance industry dinner in 1986, both of them at the time mid-level managers at different firms. Both of them by that point aware that the industry had space for men like them, but not necessarily the welcome. Both of them navigating with various degrees of grace the specific friction of being black men in rooms that had not been built with them in mind. Thomas had pulled Walter aside at the end of the dinner. "I'm going out on my own next year," Thomas said. "I've been watching you for the last hour. You're the smartest person in this room and nobody at your table knows it." Walter had laughed. "I know it," he said. Thomas had grinned. "Good, that's the right answer." They'd stayed in touch. When Thomas started his firm in 1982, Walter was one of the first people he called, not as a client, but as a friend whose opinion he trusted. By 1988, Walter was managing the pension fund for the City Workers Union in Lake County and looking for investment partners who combined strong returns with genuine fiduciary integrity. Thomas had made the call. "I'm building something, Walter, not just a fund, something worth being part of." Walter had transferred $12 million to Harlan and Associates in 1991. Over 30 years, through 2 recessions, a financial crisis, a pandemic, and the natural volatility of 3 decades of markets, the fund had grown his assets at a rate that consistently outperformed comparable funds. He'd reinvested. His initial stake had grown to $400 million in assets under management. He'd never had a problem with the numbers. His problem was with something harder to quantify. The year before the call, Walter had attended Harlan and Associates' annual client summit. It was held in the Harlan building on floor 18. The event was well run. The presentations were polished. Diana Mercer spoke for 40 minutes about the firm's strategic positioning and 5-year outlook. She was impressive. Walter had always found her impressive, but at some point during the event he'd excused himself to use the facilities. In the corridor outside the restrooms, he'd passed 2 members of the building's maintenance crew dealing with a small HVAC issue near the ceiling, a service panel open, one of them on a stepladder. He'd nodded at them as he passed. They'd looked, he noticed, slightly surprised, not at him specifically, just at being acknowledged by someone in a suit. He'd thought about that on the drive home. He'd thought about the year Thomas had called him, furious after discovering that one of the firm's senior managers had treated a cafeteria worker dismissively in front of clients. "That's not who we are," Thomas had said. "That is not this company." He'd thought about whether that standard, the Thomas standard he'd always called it privately, was still in operation. He'd started asking questions quietly, not formal inquiries, conversations. The kind you have when you've known an institution for 30 years and you've started to sense a drift. What he'd found was not corruption, not dishonesty, not mismanagement. He'd found what you always find when the founder is gone and the organization has matured, an institution that had become very good at performing its values and somewhat less consistent at living them. Not bad, not failing, just less alive than it had been. He had a fiduciary responsibility to his union members. He also had a personal responsibility to the memory of his friend. Both were telling him it might be time. The letter to Diana had been written carefully, respectfully. It had said what it meant. He had not expected a response that mattered. "Robert Harlan," Walter said. "How long has it been?" "Long enough," Robert said. "How are you, Walter?" "Old," Walter said. "Same as everyone my age who's paying attention." "You?" "The same." A pause. 2 men in their 60s and 70s on a Thursday morning with 30 years between them and a firm in the balance. "I got your letter," Robert said. "I sent it to Diana." "I know, she told me about it." Another pause. "You've been in touch with Diana," Walter said carefully. "I have been," Robert said, "for a little longer than she knew." He told him not everything, not yet, but enough. The decision to come back, the custodial job, the 3 years, the server room, the $40. Walter Forsyth was quiet through all of it. When Robert finished, Walter made a sound that was partly a laugh and partly something more. "Thomas would have done exactly that," he said. "I know. He did do something like that. Did you know, in 1994 he worked a week on the company's maintenance crew, just showed up, fixed things, nobody knew who he was." Robert went quiet. He hadn't known that. "He came home," Walter said, "and he told me about it at dinner. Said he'd learned more in 5 days than in 5 years of board reports." A pause. "He said the people who made the building run were the ones who knew if a company had its soul." Robert sat with that for a moment. "I'm my father's son," he said finally. "Yes," Walter said. "You are." "I'm calling to ask you to stay," Robert said. "One more quarter." Walter was quiet. "I'm not calling to tell you Diana's numbers are better than the competitors," Robert continued. "You know her numbers. I'm calling to tell you something else. Go ahead. She's the right person. I've watched her for 3 years, Walter, in the way my father watched, not through reports, through the building, through the people, through the choices she makes when she doesn't think anybody is measuring. And she's the real thing, the Thomas standard. It's alive in her. It's not perfect. There are gaps. She's going to close them, but it's there. You can't fake what I saw." Walter said nothing for a long moment. "She doesn't know you made this call," he said. "No, why not?" "Because she needs to earn your trust on her own terms," Robert said. "This call is about what I know. What she earns is up to her." Walter thought about that. "You could have called me 3 years ago," he said. "The moment you decided to go back in. Why now?" "Because I didn't know 3 years ago," Robert said. "Now I know." "There's something I want to ask you," Walter said. "Go ahead." "Why the mop? Why not sit in on some board meetings, hire a consultant, review the cultural audit, any number of things that a majority shareholder can do that don't involve cleaning toilets?" Robert was quiet for a moment. Because all of those things, he said, are things people see coming, their performances. The board meeting version of a company is the company's best impression of itself. The consultant review is the company on a diet before the physical. And the janitor. The janitor is what the company is when nobody's performing, Robert said. What people do when they think the only person watching is the man with the mop. And what did they do? Robert thought about the morning Diana had stepped over his wet floor sign without looking up, about the $40 check for 4 hours of work that saved millions in data exposure, about the way Deshaun Williams had worked that night without being asked because it was the right thing to do. About Patty's 14 years of expertise unrecognized, about Elia's explaining parking to new hires out of pure good nature. They did what people do, he said, good and less good, but the person at the top, she did it right, Walter, consistently over 3 years in small moments that nobody was supposed to see. And that's your standard. That's my father's standard, Robert said. I inherited it. Silence. Then Walter said, one more quarter. I want a conversation with Diana face to face, not a presentation, just a conversation. I'll pass that on. And Robert, yes, your father would have been proud. A long pause. I hope so, Robert said. That was the whole idea. Diana got the call from Walter Forsythe's office 2 days later, not a letter, a phone call. His personal assistant requesting a meeting, informal, the message said, at a time and place of Diana's choosing. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she called Gary Poulty. Can you set up something in the building for me? Not the boardroom, somewhere quieter. The floor 15 meeting room has that view of the river, Gary said. That's the one. The meeting with Walter took place on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks later. Diana had prepared nothing except herself. She'd taken Robert's advice, or rather Robert's inherited advice, and in the 3 weeks between the call and the meeting she had done something she'd never done before in 13 years of running the firm. She'd walked the building at night. Gary had arranged it. She'd come in at 10 p.m. on a Thursday in casual clothes, and Gary had introduced her to the overnight crew. Deshaun, Patty, Elias, 4 others whose names she hadn't known before that night. She'd talked to them the way Robert had described Thomas talking to people, with attention, with real questions, with the understanding that what they knew was worth knowing. She'd learned more in 4 hours than she'd learned in any quarterly review. She'd walked back to her car at 2 a.m. and sat in the parking garage for a while. She'd thought about the $40. She'd thought about what it meant when the person who saved your servers got $40 and the person who pitched a new client got a $1,000 dinner. She'd thought about the message that sent. By the time she met Walter Forsythe in the floor 15 meeting room with the view of the river, she had already begun drafting a proposal to restructure the firm's support staff compensation and recognition program. She didn't mention it to Walter. She didn't need to. They talked for 2 hours. Not about performance numbers or fee structures, about Thomas, about what the firm had been built to be, about what it meant to build something that outlasted you. Walter Forsythe did not withdraw his assets, he reinvested. Robert Harlan did not attend that meeting. He did not announce himself to the board. He did not call a press conference. He did not update his LinkedIn profile or give an interview or do any of the things a person in his position might reasonably have been expected to do. He went home to Evanston. He called his son. He called his daughter. He had them both over for dinner that weekend, Marcus and his wife Ellie and her partner, 4 of them around the table in the house where they'd all grown up, eating the roast chicken Robert had been making the same way for 40 years. He told them the story. The whole thing from the beginning, the decision, the custodial job, the 3 years, the conversation with Diana, the call with Walter. Marcus had laughed for a long time. Dad, you mopped floors. I'm good at mopping floors, Robert said. Your grandmother taught me. Ellie had been quiet through most of it. At the end, she said, Grandpa would have done the same thing. I know, Robert said. He did. After dinner, when the dishes were done and Marcus and Ellie and their partners had gone, Robert stood on the back porch and looked at the yard. The garden Catherine had kept for 20 years had gone a little wild, the way gardens do when there's nobody managing them daily. He'd been meaning to tend it. He kept not quite getting to it. He made a mental note to start in the spring. The building in Chicago, 42 stories of glass and steel with his father's name on it, was still there. It would still be there tomorrow. Diana Mercer would arrive at 7:15 with her coffee and her eyes on her phone, and now she'd look up when she passed the cleaning staff. Something had changed, not everything, not overnight. Change in large organizations is slow, accreting the way rivers carve stone, not by force but by persistence. But something had changed. His father had built a company. Robert had done the only thing a son could do for a father's legacy. He'd made sure it was still alive. He never asked for a thank you. He never told the board who he'd been for 3 years. He never made the newspapers, never gave the speech, never stood at the podium and collected the moment. He mopped the floors and watched. He made a phone call. He went home and made dinner. Somewhere in Evanston, a single dad with silver hair is probably in his garden right now, doing what he always does, paying attention without making noise about it. His father's name is still on the building. That was the whole idea.